why might you want to knit off gauge? In my mind, there are kind of three main reasons why you might want to knit off gauge, and they're not mutually exclusive. So you might, all three of these factors might be playing into your decision to knit off gauge, or it might just be one or two. It will depend very much on the case. But to my mind, the main reason that you might want to knit off gauge, the main reason that I usually want to knit off gauge, is to change the density of the fabric. Do you want a denser fabric than what the gauge is calling for? Do you want a looser fabric? Anytime you're starting to play with that, you're definitely going to be playing with gauge. Another reason, and actually the reason that the kind of dominant reason for me with the Polino pullover, is you might want to change the size or fit of the garment if we're talking about garment knitting, which is what I will be focusing on today. So, are the gaps between the sizes overly large? Or, as is unfortunately a bit inevitable, garments tend to change. The way that the motif fits, the proportion will change slightly as the sizes progress. Is that something you want to play with? Is that something you want to get a bit more control over? So sizing and fit of the garment is something that you can play with. You can't always completely revolutionize, but it's something that you can play with if you play with gauge. And finally, you might want to use a different weight of yarn. I think, we all see this quite a bit. Many of you have probably done this, right? Knitting a DK weight sweater with a worsted weight yarn, or a DK weight sweater with a fingering yarn. It's very possible to do lots of these things, and you will get a different effect than what you see in the sample piece that the designer has knitted up, but playing with gauge is a way that you can make that work for you in a way that you're happy with. So those are kind of the three main reasons that I'm thinking of when I'm deciding to knit off gauge. All sorts of other things are going to come into play with this. The makeup of the yarn, the structure of the yarn. A woolen yarn is going to tend to puff up quite a bit more than a worsted spun yarn, so you might be able to push gauge a little bit more using a woolen spun yarn than a worsted. One thing that crops up for me quite a bit is I don't love to knit with mohair, both because I don't love the fuzzy look for myself. I really like it on other people, but it just doesn't feel like me. But also because it's expensive to hold two strands of yarn together. To hold mohair with another yarn through a whole garment makes that garment a lot more expensive. So that's often something that I choose not to do. But if you're holding, say, a fingering weight yarn and a mohair together and getting a kind of DK weight gauge, that is going to create a very different fabric than if you just hold one strand of DK on its own. The mohair isn't there to puff up and fill in those gaps. You might end up with a fabric that's much more holey, that feels much less dense. So that's something that I encounter quite a lot. Other things are going to impact this, like whether it's a superwash fiber or not, what the fiber content is, right? Plant fibers will behave very differently from wool, will behave very differently from acrylic. So all of these things are going to impact your gauge, and so if you're substituting a yarn, like I think lots of us do, just because we all live in different places and different yarns are easily accessible to us or more difficult to get a hold of, different yarns are accessible in terms of cost and others are less so, right? We're often substituting yarns, but that raises all of these questions. So to me, substituting a yarn often involves doing a bit of math and figuring out a gauge that I'm happy with as opposed to the gauge that the pattern is calling for exactly. One of the things that has been really helpful for me in terms of learning to knit off gauge in a more methodical way and thinking about when I want to knit off gauge is looking at ball bands. So I brought down some yarn just to give you a few examples, because one of the things that I've learned is that and we could get more technical and talk about grist, and I know that lots of people like to use weight. Sorry, not weight as in fingering DK, but weight in terms of how many meters or yards are you getting for 100 grams, right? That can give you information about the density of the yarn, what gauge you might be happy to knit up at. Lots of that gets quite technical and is frankly beyond what I'm comfortable talking about. I'm still new to learning about grist and things like that, but what I use a lot is the suggested gauge on a ball band. I have learned that I am much happier sticking closer to that suggested gauge than I am getting too far away from it. So I brought down some examples. This is West Yorkshire Spinners Jacob Fleece. This is the yarn that I used to knit up my bighorn sweater last spring, and this is a pretty standard DK yarn. So they suggest that you knit this up at 22 stitches by 28 rows for 10 centimeters or 4 inches. That's pretty standard. I definitely know then that if I'm planning to use this yarn and I see a DK weight pattern, a pattern that calls for DK weight yarn, but it's being knit up at 18 stitches for 4 inches or 10 centimeters, that to me is a flag that I'm not going to be happy with that fabric, and I'm going to want to do some playing around or use a different yarn. On the other hand, this is another DK weight yarn. This is Rowan Moordale. I knit up a scarf for a relative who is unfortunately very poorly in Rowan Moordale just before the holidays, and I enjoyed the yarn so much that I bought myself a lovely green. So this is another DK weight yarn, listed as DK just like the Jacob, but this one is a little bit thinner. So they suggest that you knit this up at 23 stitches by 30 rows. This one was 22 by 28, 22 by 28, 23 by 30, which doesn't sound like a huge difference, but that will result in quite a different fabric if you're knitting them up at the same gauge. So that's where looking at the ball band to me is more helpful than thinking about the yarn weight alone. Just as an example, I brought down, this is Erica Knight's local wool, and this is a fingering weight yarn that I bought for a project I'm excited about a little bit later in the year. And this one, they suggest that you knit it up at 28 stitches by 36 rows, a fairly standard fingering weight. So that gives me a guidance for what kind of gauge I might be wanting to use with this yarn. And I've got some of the Briggs & Little Sport that I'm knitting my Polina pullover out of. So this is a sport weight yarn, as you might have guessed from the name. And this one calls for you to knit it at 24 stitches. They don't actually give you a row guidance, but 24 stitches for 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And one of the things that surprised me about my Polina pullover is that the Polina pullover is knit up in a sport weight. The yarn that it calls for is woolen spun. This yarn is woolen spun, and the gauge for the pattern is 24 stitches. So I didn't expect to have too many issues with this pattern until I sat down and really got started in thinking about what size I was going to knit. So it's not a foolproof plan. It doesn't always flag everything that might be of concern to me, but it's a good place to start. And I think, lots of this becomes, I'm sure that for lots of you this is already intuitive. This is the kind of thing that I think becomes fairly intuitive, and you get used to looking at a given gauge and think, oh, that's quite loose for what they're calling for, or oh, that's a quite dense knit. And so then if you already have an idea of what your preference is, you can get a feel right off the bat just as you look at a pattern about whether you're going to be happy with that gauge or not.